The railroad agent didn't knock. He shoved the door of the Hayes Ranch open hard enough to crack the frame, and the four children sitting at the breakfast table flinched like they'd heard a gunshot. Victor Hale walked in wearing a pressed suit that cost more than most men in Redstone Station earned in 6 months, and he didn't bother removing his hat. He dropped a folded document onto the table, right across Wyatt's half-eaten biscuit, and he smiled at Colton Hayes the way a man smiles when he already knows he's won. "You've got 30 days, Hale said. After that, this land belongs to the Continental Western Railroad." Little Emma, 3 years old, started to cry. Nobody moved to comfort her because everyone in that room had gone perfectly still. That was the moment everything changed, and none of them knew that the woman arriving on the afternoon train, the one nobody in town expected anything from, was carrying the only thing that could stop it. If you've ever watched someone try to take everything from a family that had already lost so much, you know exactly what that silence feels like. Stay with this story until the very end, because what happens next will stay with you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories we tell here, the ones about ordinary people who turn out to be anything but. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it really started. Colton Hayes had not slept well in 4 months. That was how long it had been since the first letter arrived from Continental Western Railroad, a politely worded document that managed to be threatening without containing a single outright threat. The company claimed that the eastern boundary of the Hayes property overlapped with a railroad corridor established 7 years earlier. The letter said the discrepancy had only recently come to light. It said the company hoped to resolve the matter amicably. It said a representative would be in contact. Colton had read that letter 3 times at the kitchen table and then folded it and put it in the drawer beneath the family Bible, where he kept things he didn't want the children to see. Then he'd gone out to the barn and stood there for a long time in the dark, listening to the horses breathe, because the barn was the only place on the property where he could fall apart without anyone watching. The ranch had been in his family for 19 years. His father had broken the ground. His mother had planted the first kitchen garden. Colton had been born in the back bedroom, and his wife, Clara, had died in that same room 4 years ago, 2 days after Emma came into the world. The ranch was not just land. It was the only continuous thread connecting everything he'd ever loved, and now a railroad company with lawyers and money and political connections was telling him that the boundary markers had been wrong from the beginning. He didn't believe it. But belief didn't matter much against a company that could afford to drag a case through territorial court for 5 years. By the time February came around, Colton had spent what little he had on a single consultation with the only attorney in Redstone Station, a man named Driscoll who wore a permanent look of mild apology and who told Colton, gently but directly, that without a competing survey conducted by a certified professional, the Hayes family didn't have much to stand on. The railroad's documentation appeared thorough. Their map bore an official territorial seal. Driscoll said he was sorry. That was when Colton had written the advertisement. He wasn't proud of it. He sat at the table for a long time before he put pen to paper, because writing the advertisement meant admitting that he could not manage alone. 4 children under 7, a ranch that needed 2 sets of hands to run properly, and a legal fight that was going to demand every spare hour he had. He needed help. He needed a partner. And there was exactly one kind of arrangement available to a widowed rancher in the Wyoming Territory in 1883 that didn't require money he didn't have. The advertisement was honest, which he figured was the least he could do. He described the ranch accurately: productive but not prosperous, remote but not isolated, a real working property with real working demands. He described the children by name and age. He mentioned that their mother had passed and that they were good children who had been through enough without being made to feel like a burden. He said he was not looking for a housekeeper or a servant. He was looking for someone willing to build something together, in good faith, on difficult ground. He did not mention the railroad. The response came from a woman named Vivian Ashcroft, writing from a boarding house in Laramie. Her letter was short and careful and told him very little about her circumstances while somehow managing to tell him quite a lot about her character. She wrote clearly, without flourish. She said she had read his advertisement twice and that she appreciated its honesty, which was rarer than people seemed to realize. She said she had experience with hard work and was not frightened of it. She said she understood the children had already suffered loss and that she would not attempt to replace what they had lost, only to offer what she could. She did not include a photograph. Colton had written back. 3 letters passed between them over 6 weeks. Careful, measured letters, both of them feeling their way forward like people crossing ice they weren't sure would hold. He noticed that she never talked about family. She never mentioned where she was from originally, or what had brought her to Laramie, or what she had done before the boarding house. He noticed the gaps, but didn't press. He had his own gaps, and he figured she'd earned the right to hers. By April, they had agreed on a date. She would arrive on the afternoon train on the 14th. Colton told the children 3 days before she was due. He sat them down at the kitchen table after supper. Wyatt, Owen, Lily, Emma. And he chose his words the way he chose everything these days, carefully and without much confidence that he was doing it right. "There's going to be a woman coming to stay with us," he said. "Her name is Miss Vivian. She and I are going to get married." Wyatt, who was 6 and had recently decided that he was old enough to have opinions about everything, looked at his father with an expression that mixed suspicion and something else. Something that looked almost like hope, which made it harder to look at. "Why?" he said. "Because we need the help," Colton said, "and because she needs a home." "Does she know about Emma?" Owen asked. Owen was 5 and had a tendency to ask questions that sounded simple and weren't. "She knows about all of you," Colton said. "I told her your names." Lily, who was 4 and had spent the last year watching everything with the kind of quiet attention that made adults uncomfortable, said nothing. She looked at her father and then looked at the door and then looked back at her father. Emma climbed off her chair and walked around the table and pushed herself onto Colton's lap without being asked, and he put his arm around her automatically, and for a moment nobody said anything. "Is she going to be like Mama?" Wyatt said finally. Colton took a breath. "No," he said. "She's going to be like herself. That's all anybody can be." The morning of the 14th, Colton drove the wagon into Redstone Station alone. He left the children with his neighbor, May Delaney, a woman in her 60s who smelled of tobacco and had strong opinions about everything and was, despite all of that, genuinely kind. May had been skeptical about the mail-order arrangement from the moment Colton mentioned it. "You don't know a thing about this woman," she'd told him. "I know enough," he said. "You know what she chose to write down in a letter," May said. "That's not the same thing." She wasn't wrong, but Colton didn't have a better option, and he was tired enough that he'd stopped waiting for one. The station platform was more crowded than usual when the afternoon train pulled in. Word had gotten around, the way word always got around in a town of 400 people, and there were a dozen bystanders arranged with varying degrees of subtlety along the platform edge, some of them genuinely there to meet passengers, and some of them there to see what the Hayes woman looked like. Colton stood near the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, which he hadn't entirely intended but couldn't seem to stop. He watched the train doors open. He watched passengers descend. A cattle buyer he recognized, a family he didn't, 2 young men who looked like they were heading to the mines. And then she stepped down. He would think about that moment later, the exact second Vivian Ashcroft set foot on the platform at Redstone Station. And he would have trouble describing it in a way that was accurate without also sounding like he was saying more than he meant. She was small, that was the first thing. Smaller than he'd pictured, though he hadn't pictured much. She was wearing a coat that had been mended at both elbows, and she was carrying a single weathered suitcase that looked like it had made the trip from somewhere much farther away than Laramie. She moved carefully, like someone who had learned not to expect solid ground. The people along the platform stared. Colton heard someone behind him make a low sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything he could name, but something dismissive. He heard a woman's voice murmur something to another woman. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. Vivian stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked along the platform until she found him, and something in her expression shifted. Not relief, exactly. More like recognition, like she'd been braced for the worst and was recalibrating. She walked toward him and stopped a few feet away and looked up at him, and he could see, up close, that she was exhausted in a way that didn't have anything to do with the train ride. There were shadows under her eyes that looked like they'd been there a while. She was younger than he'd expected, or maybe the same age but worn down in a way that made the difference hard to measure. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Her voice was quiet but even. "I'm Vivian Ashcroft. I'm sorry, if I'm not what you expected." He looked at her for a moment. He was aware of the people watching. He was aware of the distance between what they were seeing and what they were thinking, and the gap between those two things sat in his chest like a stone. "You're what you wrote in your letters," he said. "That's what I expected." Something moved in her face that wasn't quite a smile, but he thought it might be the beginning of one. Tick. The wagon ride back to the ranch took 40 minutes, and they spent most of it in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, but not a comfortable one either. The kind of silence between two strangers who've made a significant decision and are now sitting with the weight of it. At some point, past the second creek crossing, Vivian said, "How old are they?" "The children." He told her. "That's a lot of years close together," she said. Clara wanted them close. She said she'd always hated being an only child. He paused. "I probably shouldn't have said that." "It's fine," Vivian said. "She was their mother. She doesn't stop existing because I arrived." He looked at her sideways, but she was watching the road ahead. After a moment, he turned back to the road too. "The youngest one, Emma, she doesn't really remember her," he said. "The other three do, in different ways. Lily doesn't talk about it much. Owen asks questions sometimes. Wyatt is angry about it, which makes more sense than it probably sounds." "It makes complete sense," Vivian said. He glanced at her again. "Anger is easier than grief," she said, "especially at 6. He didn't answer that, but he thought about it for the rest of the ride. The children were waiting on the porch when the wagon came up the lane. May Delaney stood behind them with her arms crossed, which was her natural resting posture and meant nothing in particular. The 4 of them were arranged in descending height: Wyatt, Owen, Lily, Emma, like something out of a photograph, except that Wyatt had his arms crossed too, which he'd picked up from May, and Owen was eating something he definitely hadn't been given permission to eat, and Lily was watching the wagon with that careful, contained expression of hers, and Emma was holding on to Lily's hand with both of hers. Colton pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down and came around to offer his hand to Vivian, which she took without making anything of it, which he appreciated. They walked toward the porch together and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Children," Colton said, "this is Miss Vivian." Nobody said anything for a moment. Owen swallowed whatever he'd been eating, which took a second. Emma stared at Vivian with the uncomplicated directness of a 3-year-old and then said, "Your coat has a hole in it." Vivian looked down at her sleeve. "It does," she said. "It's been a hard winter." "We have thread," Emma said. "We could fix it." Vivian looked up from her sleeve to Emma's face, and for just a moment something crossed her expression that Colton couldn't quite name, something that looked like it hurt, in a way that had nothing to do with pain. "Thank you," she said. "That's very kind." Wyatt said nothing. He looked at Vivian the way he looked at most things these days, measuring, suspicious, withholding judgment while clearly already having formed one. Owen introduced himself with the slightly formal courtesy he'd been working on, having recently decided that courtesy was something worth practicing. Lily stepped forward quietly and said, "Hello, Miss Vivian," and then stepped back. May Delaney came down from the porch and shook Vivian's hand with the grip of someone who had decided to reserve judgment but wanted to get a sense of the person regardless. She said, "The stew's on the stove," which was both a practical statement and, from May, something close to a welcome. The first week was awkward in the way that first weeks almost always are, and more awkward than most because of how much everyone was trying not to make it awkward. Vivian learned the kitchen by doing, not by asking, which Colton noticed and appreciated. She made mistakes and didn't apologize for them more than once. She learned quickly where things were, how the stove ran, which drawer stuck. She was careful with the children, not effusive, not distant, but careful. She paid attention. She watched who needed what and moved accordingly without making a production of it. The children adjusted at different speeds. Emma was the fastest. By the 3rd day, she had appointed herself Vivian's guide to the ranch, pulling her from room to room, narrating the contents of cupboards, introducing her to the dog, the chickens, and a particular rock behind the barn that Emma considered significant. Vivian followed her with serious attention, which Emma received as her due. Owen warmed up by the end of the first week, mostly through the medium of questions. He asked Vivian where she'd grown up, what the biggest city she'd ever seen was, whether she'd ever been on a steamboat, what she thought about the possibility of getting a second dog. Vivian answered each question with real consideration, which Owen recognized and responded to. Lily took longer. Not hostile, Lily was never hostile, but watchful. She'd bring Vivian her plate at dinner and say thank you when Vivian braided her hair, and she'd sit near her in the evenings without initiating anything. Colton figured Lily was doing what Lily always did, which was taking her time deciding what she actually felt before committing to it. Wyatt did not thaw. I was polite, which cost him visibly, and he did his chores without complaint, and he never said anything rude. But there was a wall, and it was solid, and Colton wasn't sure what it was going to take. He didn't push it. He figured Wyatt had earned the right to take his time. The railroad sent another letter in the second week of May. Colton read it alone at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. This one was from Victor Hale directly, the company's regional land agent, whose name had appeared on every document so far, and whose signature carried the particular quality of a man who has never been told no in a way that stuck. The letter was polite. The letter was almost friendly. It acknowledged that the dispute was unfortunate and expressed the company's genuine desire to reach a fair resolution. It suggested that perhaps Mr. Hayes would be open to discussing a reasonable buyout figure, given that continued litigation was costly for everyone involved. The letter did not say that the Hayes family would lose. It didn't have to. Colton folded it and sat there for a while. Then he heard a sound from the hallway and looked up. Vivian was standing in the doorway in her coat, which she'd thrown over her nightgown. Apparently she'd already stopped sleeping through the nighttime noises of a ranch house the way newcomers sometimes took a while to stop doing. She looked at him, and then at the folded letter. "Bad news?" she said. "Pressure," he said. "It's what they do. They don't need to take you to court if they can wear you down first." She came in and sat down across from him. He hadn't intended to talk about it, had been managing the whole situation carefully, separately, not wanting to make it her problem before she'd even found her footing. But she was sitting across from him and looking at him directly, and something about the way she did that, without any particular urgency, just a kind of level attention, made it hard to keep things in their compartments. He told her about the land claim, about the railroad's documentation, about Driscoll, and what Driscoll had said about needing a competing survey, about the 30 days. She listened without interrupting, which most people were not good at. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I look at the map? The one the railroad submitted." He looked at her. "Why?" She paused. Just a beat. A brief, almost imperceptible hesitation that he noticed but couldn't interpret. "I just want to understand what we're working with," she said. He got up and retrieved the map from the drawer and spread it on the table between them. She looked at it. Really looked at it. Not the way someone glances at a document to seem helpful, but with a focus that was specific and trained. She leaned over it. Her finger traced the eastern boundary line without touching the paper. Her lips moved very slightly, and he realized she was counting something. Intervals, maybe, or measurements. "There," she said after a long moment. "There what?" She pointed to a section of the line. "This boundary marker, the notation here, the reference point they're using. It's different from the one in the original federal land grant." She looked up at him. "Do you have the original grant document? The one from when your father filed?" He did. He got it. She spread it beside the railroad's map and compared them with the focused intensity of someone doing something she'd done many times before, and the room got very quiet. "The reference point has been moved," she said. "It's subtle, but it's there. Whoever drew this railroad map didn't use the same baseline the original survey used. Either it was an error or it was deliberate." Colton stared at her. "How do you know how to read these?" She looked at him across the table, and there it was again. That slight hesitation, like she was calculating something, like she was deciding. "I used to work with survey documents," she said finally, "a long time ago." He waited for more. More didn't come. "Vivian," he said. She looked down at the map. "I was an assistant," she said, "to a surveyor. Before things changed. I spent 4 years riding the territory, recording measurements, filing field notes. I know what a real boundary notation looks like." She paused. "And I know what it looks like when one has been changed." The lamp between them burned low, and outside the wind came up against the house the way it always did in the evenings, and Colton looked at the woman across from him, the quiet, exhausted, carefully worded woman who had stepped off a train with a mended coat and a weathered suitcase. and he thought that he had completely failed to understand who he was dealing with. "What else do you know?" he said. She was quiet for a long moment. "I know that if you can find the original stone markers," she said slowly, "the ones the first survey team placed, your case doesn't depend on anyone's map. The land speaks for itself. The railroad will say the markers don't exist anymore. That's already their position." "I know," she said, "but I have the field notes from that survey, the original ones." She said it quietly, almost under her breath, like she was still deciding whether to say it at all. "I've had them since. I kept them when everything else was destroyed. I've been carrying them for 3 years." The silence in the kitchen stretched out. "Where?" Colton said. She looked at him for one long, considering moment. Then she pushed back her chair, got up, and went down the hallway. He heard her door open. A minute later, she came back carrying the battered leather suitcase, the one that had looked so inadequate on the platform at Redstone Station, the one the whole town had clocked as evidence of her failure. She set it on the table and opened the latches. Inside, beneath a thin layer of clothing, were papers. Folded pages, some of them water-stained, all of them covered in dense handwritten notation. She lifted the stack carefully, the way you handle something fragile, and set it on the table beside the maps. "These are the field notes from the original Hayes Boundary Survey," she said, "filed by the surveyor I worked for. His name was Edmund Carver. He was thorough and honest, and the railroad had him removed from his position 2 years after the survey because he refused to alter his records." She smoothed the top page with one hand. "They destroyed everything they could get to, but I had already made copies, and I kept the originals that were in our field office." Colton looked at the pages. He looked at her. "You've been carrying evidence against the Continental Western Railroad in that suitcase," he said. "Yes?" "For 3 years." "Yes." "Why didn't you—" He stopped, started again. "Why are you only telling me this now?" She looked at him steadily. "Because now it matters," she said, "and because I had to know you were someone worth trusting with it." Outside, the wind moved across the Wyoming plain, and the lamp guttered once and steadied. Somewhere down the hall, one of the children shifted in sleep. The night held everything quiet for a long moment. Colton put his hand flat on the table, not on the papers, just on the table beside them, a steadying gesture directed mostly at himself. "The railroad has lawyers," he said, "and a judge they know." "I know," she said. They're going to come after you if they find out what you have." "I know that too." "Vivian," he said, and his voice came out different than he intended, lower, more direct. "You came here. You came to this specific ranch, answered this specific advertisement." He paused. "Did you know whose land this was before you wrote to me?" She held his gaze, not flinching, not looking away, but also not answering immediately, which was its own kind of answer. "The name Hayes was on the land grant in the field notes," she said finally. "I knew the property was contested. I didn't know if it was the same family." A pause. "But I thought it might be." The lamp burned. "So you came here," he said. "I needed somewhere to go," she said, "and you needed someone. And those field notes have been sitting in that suitcase for 3 years while people lost their land, and I couldn't stop any of it because I had no way to get them in front of a court that would listen." She stopped, straightened. "You have a court date. You have 30 days. That changes things." He sat with that for a long moment. "You came here to fight," he said. "I came here to survive," she said. "Same as you. But if fighting is what it takes—" She glanced at the suitcase, and then at the maps, and then at him. "Then I've been ready for 3 years." He didn't answer right away. He sat across from her in the lamplight in the kitchen of the house he'd been born in, with the evidence that might save it spread between them on the table. And he thought about the 30 days, and the lawyer, and the children asleep down the hall, and the way Vivian had looked on the platform, small, exhausted, apologizing for herself before she'd given anyone reason to be disappointed. And he understood now that what she'd been was not weak. What she'd been was careful. "All right," he said at last. "Then we fight." She looked at him across the table, and this time what moved across her face was not the beginning of a smile. It was something quieter and more serious than that. The look of someone who has been waiting a long time to have someone say exactly those words. "We'll need to verify the stone markers first," she said, "before we can put anything in front of the court. If the physical markers don't match what the field notes say, nothing else holds. How soon? As soon as the ground is passable. She pulled one of the field note pages toward her and studied it. I know exactly where they should be. Down the hall, there was the small sound of footsteps. Light, deliberate, recognizable. Lily, who sometimes walked in her sleep and sometimes walked when she wasn't sleeping. A moment later, the kitchen doorway held the small shape of a 4-year-old in her nightgown, hair loose, holding a cloth rabbit by one ear, blinking in the light. She looked at her father. She looked at Vivienne. She looked at the papers on the table. Is everything all right? She said, in the way of a child who has learned to ask that question carefully. Yes, Colton said. Go back to bed, sweetheart. Lily looked at Vivienne one more time, that careful, measuring look, and then she crossed the kitchen and put one hand on the table and stood there for a moment. Then she said, Good night, Miss Vivienne, and turned and padded back down the hall. Vivienne watched her go. She was quiet for a moment after the footsteps faded. She's keeping watch, she said. Has been since she could walk, I'd guess. Since her mother got sick, Colton said. She was 2.5. Vivienne nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else about it. She turned back to the field notes, and Colton pulled his chair around to her side of the table, and they worked by lamplight until the night went from deep to deeper, and the stars outside the window began their slow rotation west, and neither of them said anything about trusting each other because they were already doing it, and that was enough. They worked until almost 2 in the morning, and when Colton finally said they should sleep, Vivienne didn't argue. She gathered the field notes with the same care she'd used taking them out, straightening each page, aligning the edges, setting them back in the suitcase in an order that clearly meant something to her, even if he didn't yet understand the system. She latched the case and carried it back to her room, and he heard the soft click of her door, and then the house was quiet again. He sat at the kitchen table for a few more minutes by himself. He wasn't sure what he'd expected from this arrangement. He'd told himself, going into it, that he was being practical, that this was a business arrangement dressed in the language of marriage, and that the important thing was that both parties understood what they were signing up for. He'd told himself that feelings were not the point, that surviving was the point, that getting the children through the next year intact was the point. He had not expected to sit across a table at midnight from a woman who had been quietly carrying the evidence to save his family's land in a battered suitcase for 3 years, waiting for somewhere to put it. He went to bed. He didn't sleep particularly well, but it was a different kind of not sleeping, less the cold, grinding anxiety of the past 4 months and more, the restless energy of a problem that had shifted from impossible to merely very hard. Morning came the way it always did on a working ranch, without asking whether you were ready. Colton was at the stove when the children came down, and Vivienne was already at the table, which surprised him. She'd beaten him to the kitchen by the look of it, and she'd put water on and sliced bread and was now reading through the field notes again with her coffee. The paper spread carefully to the side so nothing was near the bread knife. She looked up when the children appeared and said good morning to each of them, and Emma climbed immediately onto the chair beside her and tried to look at the papers, and Vivienne moved one toward her, not one of the important ones, just a page of measurements, and let her look. What are all the numbers? Emma said. They tell you exactly where things are, Vivienne said. So if someone tries to move them, you can prove where they were supposed to be. Emma studied the page with great seriousness. That's smart, she said. Somebody was, Vivienne said. Wyatt came in last, already dressed for work, and he looked at the papers on the table and at Vivienne and at his father, and the look on his face was not quite hostile, but it was asking a question he wasn't ready to put into words. He sat down and ate his breakfast without saying much. Colton didn't push it. There were too many other things to push. After breakfast, Colton told May Delaney about the field notes. May came over mid-morning. She did most days, to check in on the children or help with something, or to drink coffee and offer opinions nobody had asked for. And she sat down at the table across from Vivienne and listened to the whole thing with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral, which with May was the closest thing to rapt attention. When Vivienne finished, May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The railroad had Edmund Carver fired? 2 years after the original Hayes survey, Vivienne said. He wouldn't change his records for them. They found reasons, questioned his methods, challenged 2 of his other surveys, made it too expensive and too exhausting for him to keep fighting. She paused. He retired to Montana. I don't know if he's still alive. Could he testify? Colton said. Vivienne shook her head slowly. Possibly. But we can't count on it, and we don't have time to try to locate him. What we have is better, if the stone markers are where my notes say they are. She smoothed a page on the table. Physical evidence doesn't get tired. It doesn't have its reputation questioned. You show the judge the marker, you show him the notes that predicted exactly where it would be, and the railroad's altered map becomes what it is. May looked at Vivienne the way she looked at everything, carefully, without committing. Then she said, "You're not what I expected." "I know," Vivienne said. "I'm getting used to hearing that." May made a short sound that might have been approval. "All right," she said. "What do you need from me?" What they needed, as it turned out, was time, and the particular kind of practical help that only a woman like May could provide. While Colton and Vivienne planned the boundary walk, May took the children, kept them occupied, fed them without complaint, and managed the particular diplomacy of 4 children between 3 and 6 who were not accustomed to their household being rearranged. Wyatt remained the problem. It wasn't anything overt. He did what he was asked. He was never rude to Vivienne's face. But on the 3rd morning, when Colton went to find him after breakfast and couldn't, he checked the barn first out of habit and found his son sitting on an overturned bucket in the far corner, doing nothing, just sitting. "Wyatt," he said. "I'm fine," Wyatt said, before Colton could say anything else. "I didn't ask." "I know. You were going to." Colton sat down on a hay bale. The barn smelled of horses and old wood and something like permanence, which was probably why they both ended up in it when things felt uncertain. "You want to tell me what's going on with you?" Wyatt looked at his boots. "She knows a lot about our land," he said. "Why does she know about our land?" Colton looked at his son. 6 years old, arms still crossed in that posture he'd borrowed from May. Jaw set in a way that looked a lot like the way Clara's jaw had set when she'd decided something. "She worked with surveyors," Colton said. "She knows about land records and property lines. That's why she can help us." "But she knew before she came," Wyatt said. He looked up. "She knew about our land before she got on the train, didn't she?" He was 6. Colton kept forgetting, in moments like these, that 6 could be that perceptive. "She knew this land was in dispute," he said. "Yes. So she didn't just come because she wanted a home," Wyatt said. "She came because of the land." "People can have more than one reason for doing something," Colton said. Wyatt thought about this. He was quiet in the way he got when he was actually processing, rather than just deciding he'd already made up his mind, which gave Colton a small amount of hope. "Is she going to leave after?" he said finally. "After the court thing?" "No," Colton said. "She's not." "How do you know?" "Because she made a promise," Colton said. "Same as I did. And because I think she's someone who means what she says." Wyatt looked at his father. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he also didn't look closed off the same way he had. He uncrossed his arms slowly, like it was a concession he was making deliberately. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Colton said. They walked back to the house together, and it wasn't resolved, but it was a little less stuck. On the 5th day, Vivienne and Colton went to find the stone markers. She had been clear from the beginning that this part was essential. The field notes were evidence, but they were paper, and paper could be argued against. The railroad had their own papers, their own seals, their own lawyers ready to challenge the provenance of anything Vivienne presented. The stone markers were different. A carved granite boundary marker driven into the earth by an original survey team could not be forged retroactively, and if it stood where Vivienne's field notes said it would stand, the railroad's altered map would not survive contact with a judge who still believed in physical reality. "How confident are you?" Colton asked as they rode out along the eastern fence line. "In the notes?" She was riding May's horse, which was a reasonably mannered bay that seemed to have decided she was acceptable. "Very confident. I cross-referenced them against 2 federal land records before I left Laramie. The measurements are accurate." "But you haven't been here before." "Not to this specific property." She looked out across the flats, studying the lay of the land the way he'd started to notice she did everything, methodically, without haste, without the particular form of impatience that usually hid itself as thoroughness. "The general region, yes. I covered a lot of this territory in 4 years." They rode in silence for a while. The morning was cool and the grass was brown still from the winter, but starting to show the faint first color of spring at the root level. The sky was that specific Wyoming blue that looked like someone had stretched it too tight. "Will you tell me about it?" Colton said. "The surveying work." She was quiet for a moment. I was starting to recognize her pauses. There were different kinds. There was the pause of someone who didn't have an answer yet, and there was the pause of someone who had an answer they were deciding whether to give, and there was the pause of someone who had an answer that cost something to say. This was the third kind. "Edmund Carver was a fair man," she said finally. "He hired women as assistants when no other surveyor in the territory would, because he cared about accuracy more than convention, and he said women were better at transcription because they'd been trained from childhood to pay attention to things men assumed weren't worth noticing." She paused. "He was right, as it turned out." "How did you find him?" "My father knew him, distantly. After my father died, I was 19. I had no money and no other option, and Mr. Carver needed an assistant for a survey in the Bighorns. I rode 3 days to get to where the crew was starting." A small silence. "He hired me on the spot. He said anyone willing to ride 3 days for the chance deserved a chance." Colton let that sit. "You did it for 4 years?" 4 years, 2 months, and some weeks," she said. "We covered most of the Northern Territory. I learned everything: triangulation, baseline measurement, how to read topography, how to interpret the federal land records back to the original grants, how to spot when records had been altered." She glanced at him. "That last part wasn't something Carver taught specifically. It was something I figured out after Continental Western approached him the first time." "What did they want?" "The same thing they always want," she said flatly. "They had plans for a rail corridor through territory that was already claimed. Some of the claims were homesteads with families on them. They wanted the boundary records adjusted to make the overlap look minimal. Or better, to make it look like it had been there all along and the homesteaders were the ones encroaching." She shifted in the saddle. "Carver refused. He was meticulous about it, documented every approach they made, recorded every conversation. He thought it would protect him. It didn't. It gave them more rope to use against him," she said. "When they finally moved to have his license challenged, everything he'd recorded became evidence of a man with a vendetta against the company rather than a man protecting his records." She pressed her lips together. "He was naive about how these things work. He thought the facts would be enough." "But you kept the records anyway," Colton said. "He didn't know I had copies." She looked out at the horizon. "I made them over the last 6 months before everything fell apart. I didn't tell him because I didn't want him to be implicated further, and because—" She stopped. "Because what?" "Because I already knew it was going to end badly," she said, "and I wanted there to be something left afterward that could still be used." He thought about that. He thought about a woman in her early 20s riding the Wyoming Territory with a survey crew, quietly making copies of records that could destroy a railroad company's fraudulent claims, carrying them out in a leather case when everything collapsed, and then spending 3 years in a Laramie boarding house trying to figure out where they could do any good. "The boarding house," he said. "How long?" 18 months, she said. "I did laundry mostly, sometimes copying work. I was trying to find a case that was still in time, a contested claim where the original survey records were still relevant and where there was a judge who hadn't already been managed." She said that last word carefully, with a specific flatness that told him what she meant by it. "It was harder than I expected. Until you saw my advertisement." "Until I saw your advertisement." She looked at him. "I want you to understand that I would have come regardless. I meant everything I wrote in those letters. I wasn't coming here to use your household as a vehicle for this." She gestured toward the suitcase that hung from her saddle. "But I would be lying if I said the timing wasn't also relevant." "I know," he said. "I'm not angry." She looked at him steadily. "You might have reason to be." "You came to help," he said, "with more than one thing. That's not a betrayal." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she turned back to the horizon and said quietly, "Your father chose a good piece of land." "He did," Colton said. They rode on. The first marker was exactly where Vivian's field note said it would be. It was buried, not deliberately hidden, but simply sunk over the years, the earth having slowly worked its way up around the carved granite post, the way it works around anything that sits still long enough. Vivian dismounted and crouched in the grass at the base of a low ridge, her finger tracing the edge of the post where it showed above ground, and Colton crouched beside her, and they both looked at the carving on the exposed face, a series of numbers and a directional mark, cut deep enough that 19 years of Wyoming weather hadn't touched them. Vivian pulled the field notes from her coat and unfolded a page and held it next to the marker. Her hand was very steady. The notation matched, not approximately, exactly. She let out a slow breath. It was the only external sign of the tension she'd been carrying, that one breath, and then she was composed again and already looking at the note page for the next reference point. There should be a second one, she said, 300 yards east-northeast near a river bend. If the notes are right about this one, they're right about that one. They're right about this one, Colton said. She folded the page and stood up. Her coat was damp at the knees from the ground. She didn't notice, or noticed, and didn't care. And Colton had the brief thought that he was watching someone who had been waiting 3 years to find exactly this, and who was not going to let a wet coat slow her down. The second marker took longer to locate, not because it wasn't there, but because the river had cut slightly differently than it had 19 years ago. And the bend that the notes described was now a few degrees west of where a first reading suggested. Vivian recalculated with the patient efficiency of someone doing arithmetic she'd done hundreds of times, and adjusted, and they found it in the bank of the river, half embedded in root growth, the carved face tilted slightly toward the water, but still perfectly legible. Second notation, second match. Colton stood at the river's edge and looked at the marker, and at Vivian, who was kneeling beside it taking a rubbing of the carving onto paper with a charcoal stick she'd pulled from her coat pocket. She was unhurried, thorough, and entirely focused on what she was doing, and he thought again, as he had at the kitchen table, as he had on the wagon ride back from the station, that he had made a significant error in his assessment of who he was dealing with, and that it was an error he was increasingly glad to have been wrong about. "We need to document these before we present anything to the court," she said, without looking up. "Measurements from the current survey marker to the natural reference points. The river, the ridge. Any jury or judge worth convincing is going to want to see the chain of evidence, not just my notes." "You said we don't have a survey professional." "We don't need one for this stage," she said. "We need precise measurements. I can do that. What we eventually need is a court-appointed surveyor to come out and verify." She finished the rubbing and stood up, folding the paper. "But if we can show the judge the markers exist exactly where the original notes say they are, he'll order the verification himself. We don't have to convince him of everything. We just have to convince him there's enough to look at." Colton looked at the river. "Hale is going to know something is happening when we file." "Yes," she said. "He'll try to get ahead of it." "He'll try," she said. "That's why we don't tell Driscoll more than he needs to know until we're ready to file. And we don't go back to that court date empty-handed." She tucked the rubbing inside her coat. "Do you trust Driscoll?" Colton thought about it. "He's honest," he said finally. "Not particularly brave, but honest." "Then we give him what he needs to be effective, and nothing extra," she said. "Keep the field notes out of it until we're in the courtroom." They were quiet riding home. The sun was past noon and heading toward late afternoon, and the light had that amber quality it got in May in Wyoming. Warm, but with an edge to it, like it was reminding you that warm was still contingent. Colton watched the shadow of his horse stretch long across the grass, and thought about 30 days, and stone markers, and a woman who had ridden 3 days at 19 for the chance to do work that mattered. 3 days later, Victor Hale came to the ranch. Not with deputies this time, not with papers. He came alone, which was in some ways more unsettling, in a good horse and clean clothes, and he knocked on the door with the measured courtesy of a man who wants you to believe he's being reasonable. Colton opened the door. Hale smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind that had probably worked well enough in enough offices and parlors that Hale had stopped questioning whether it worked everywhere. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," Colton said. "But come in." The children were with May. Vivian was at the table, chit. She had the field notes out, which she'd been cross-referencing against the measurements they'd taken at the markers. But when Hale stepped through the door, she gathered them with one unhurried motion and set them face down beside her chair. And by the time Hale's eyes found her, she had a coffee cup in front of her and a neutral expression on her face. Hale took her in with a brief glance that he clearly tried to make unreadable and didn't quite succeed at. He registered her. the presence of someone he hadn't expected, in a position that suggested she'd been working at that table. And then he redirected to Colton with the smooth ease of a man used to quickly recalibrating. "I wanted to extend an offer of conversation before this goes further," Hale said, sitting down across the table without being asked. "I understand you've engaged Driscoll. He's a capable man. But litigation is expensive for everyone, and the company's position is solid. I'd rather see this resolved without—" "Without what?" Colton said. Hale paused. The smooth surface flickered. "Without difficulty," he said. "The difficulty is already here," Colton said. "You brought it when you filed a claim on land my family has held for 19 years. The company's records are what they are," Colton said. "And so are ours." Hale looked at him. Something had shifted in the room, some quality of the silence, and Hale was the kind of man who noticed atmospheric changes. His eyes moved to Vivian again, a longer look this time, and she met it without expression and didn't look away. "This is my wife," Colton said. "Vivian." "Pleasure," Hale said, with a version of the practiced smile directed at her. "Is it?" Vivian said pleasantly. Something moved behind Hale's eyes. He turned back to Colton. "The company is prepared to offer a fair market value for the affected portion of the property," he said. "Given the expense and uncertainty of court proceedings, that may be the most practical outcome." "Which portion specifically?" Vivian said. Hale turned to her. She was watching him with an expression of mild, polite attention. "The eastern boundary section," he said. "The corridor we've documented." "How wide is the corridor in the company's documentation?" A short pause. "Approximately 60 yards. "At what reference point?" she said. Hale looked at her with the expression of a man who has walked into a room he wasn't prepared for. "I beg your pardon?" "The baseline reference for the eastern boundary measurement," she said. "What does the company's survey use as its primary reference point?" "The federal land grant specifies the original survey's reference point. If the company's documentation uses a different one, the measurements would naturally differ. I'm curious what accounts for the discrepancy." She picked up her coffee cup. "That's all." The room was very quiet. Hale looked at Vivian Ashcroft, the frail, quiet, plainly dressed mail-order bride who had arrived in Redstone Station with nothing, and who was sitting at a ranch table in Wyoming talking about baseline survey reference points, like someone who had spent years making sure those details mattered. And for just a moment, the practiced ease left his face entirely. What replaced it was not anger, not yet. It was something more calculated than that. He stood up. He buttoned his coat, which he hadn't unbuttoned. He said, "I'll tell the company you weren't interested in discussing alternatives." "Tell them whatever you like," Colton said. Hale walked to the door. At the threshold he turned back and the smile was gone now, and what was under it was closer to the truth of the man. He looked at Vivian. "You should think carefully about your position, Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Some things are easier to let go of than others." The door shut behind him. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Vivian set down her coffee cup, turned back to the field notes she'd gathered, and began laying them out again on the table. "He knows," she said. "He suspects," Colton said. "Close enough," she said. "We need to move faster. What's that?" The days that followed had a quality of controlled urgency that Colton hadn't experienced before. Not the anxious, reactive urgency of the past 4 months, where he'd been responding to one threat after another without any footing of his own, but something more purposeful. They had something now. They had the markers, and they had the notes, and they had a direction, and the difference that made to his ability to sleep at night was something he hadn't fully anticipated. Vivian worked. That was the only way to describe it. She worked with the focused intensity of someone operating on borrowed time, which in practical terms they were. She produced a detailed written account of the field notes' provenance, her own history with Edmund Carver's survey operation, and the specific alterations visible in the railroad's submitted map compared with the federal land grant baseline. She wrote it in clear, formal language, without emotion, in a style that Colton recognized as the particular prose of someone who had spent years writing official documentation. He watched her do it across the dinner table while the children did their reading lessons, and he thought about what she'd said the first night. "I came here to survive, same as you." And he thought that surviving looked different from the outside than it did from inside the person doing it, and that he had been doing Vivian Ashcroft a specific kind of disservice from the moment she stepped off that train. Owen, Vivian said without looking up from her writing. You're reading the same line again. Owen, who had been staring at the ceiling while his finger tracked mechanically across the page, looked surprised and then guilty and then impressed against his will. How did you know? Your finger wasn't moving at your reading speed, she said. It was moving at your pretending to read speed. There's a difference, Owen said. There's always a difference, she said, and turned a page. Owen went back to his book with a slightly more genuine effort. Across the table, Lily glanced at Vivian and then at her own book, and then allowed herself, briefly and without wanting to be seen doing it, to smile. Wyatt watched all of this from the end of the table where he was supposedly doing his arithmetic. He didn't say anything, but his pencil slowed down for a moment, and the set of his shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly. Colton noticed. He was doing a lot of noticing these days. 8 days before the court date, Driscoll came out to the ranch. Colton had sent a note asking him to come, but hadn't said more than that. Driscoll arrived looking mildly anxious, which was his baseline, and sat down at the kitchen table and accepted coffee, and Colton nodded to Vivian. She laid the documentation out in order. The original federal land grant, the field notes, with the provenance account attached, the rubbings from the stone markers, each with the location measurements they'd taken, the side-by-side comparison of the railroad's submitted map against the land grant baseline, with the reference point discrepancy highlighted in the margin. Driscoll looked at all of it without speaking. He picked up one page, set it down, picked up another. He looked at the rubbings, and then at the field notes, and then at Vivian. You took these measurements yourself? He said. Together, Vivian said, glancing at Colton. He measured, I recorded. We can both testify to the process. And the field notes? You have documentation of their provenance? Your original employment with Edmund Carver's operation? I have 3 letters in my possession from Carver on his professional letterhead that reference my work on the Hayes survey specifically, she said. I can produce those. Driscoll looked at the page in his hand. He was quiet for a long moment. He was one of those people who thought visibly. You could see the processing, the calculation, the cautious optimism being tempered by the equally cautious awareness of what could go wrong. This reference point discrepancy, he said finally. If the railroad surveyor is brought in to testify, they'll claim it's a standard variation in interpretation, Vivian said. I've already written a rebuttal to that argument. The federal land grant doesn't allow for interpretive variation on the baseline reference. The language is specific. She slid a page across to him. Page 3. The relevant statute is cited in the footnote. Driscoll looked at the page. Then he looked at Vivian. Then he looked at Colton. Where did you find her? He said. She found me, Colton said. Driscoll set the page down carefully. All right, he said, and it was the first time Colton had heard genuine confidence in the man's voice. All right, we're going to need the court to order an independent verification of the stone markers. I'll file for that immediately. With this documentation, he stopped, steadied himself. With this documentation, a reasonable judge will grant it. Is Judge Carver reasonable? Vivian said. A beat. Judge Carver is fair, Driscoll said, with the precision of a man choosing his words carefully. He's also been known to move quickly when the evidence is clear. Then let's make the evidence as clear as possible, Vivian said. Outside, the evening was coming down over the ranch, that particular Wyoming evening that turned the sky copper and violet above the flats. And inside the kitchen, Driscoll gathered the documents with the reverence of someone who understands what he's holding, and Colton felt for the first time in 4 months that the ground beneath his family was solid. Not safe, not yet, but solid. And for tonight, that was enough. May Delaney came in through the back door with the children behind her, all 4 of them smelling of the outdoors in the early evening, and Emma went straight to Vivian and climbed onto her lap without asking, which she had stopped bothering to ask about 3 days ago. And Vivian put her arm around her automatically and kept talking to Driscoll about the filing timeline, and Wyatt stood in the doorway and watched, and this time he did not cross his arms. Colton saw it. He looked away before Wyatt could notice him looking. Some things needed to happen in private, even when they happened in the middle of a full room. Driscoll filed the motion for independent verification on a Tuesday, and by Thursday the railroad's legal team had already responded. Colton found out from Driscoll, who came out to the ranch in person rather than sending a note, which told him before the man even opened his mouth that the news wasn't simple. Driscoll sat down at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his expression carrying that particular weight of someone who is trying to figure out how to say something without causing a panic. They filed a counter-motion, he said, challenging the admissibility of any evidence not previously disclosed during the initial claim period. Colton looked at him. What does that mean for the field notes? It means they're going to argue that any documentation produced after the initial filing, which includes everything we've put together in the past 2 weeks, should be excluded on procedural grounds. Driscoll turned his hat in his hands. It's a standard obstruction tactic. They're not trying to win on the merits. They're trying to win on the clock. Vivian had been standing at the stove when Driscoll arrived. She came to the table and sat down and looked at the motion document Driscoll had brought, reading it with the same concentrated attention she gave everything. And the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Emma playing in the next room and the distant noise of Owen and Wyatt somewhere outside. The counter-motion cites Territorial Procedure Code, Section 14, she said after a moment. It does, Driscoll said. Section 14 applies to evidence manufactured after filing, she said, not to evidence that predates the filing and was simply not yet presented. She looked at Driscoll. The field notes are 19 years old. The stone markers are 19 years old. We didn't create them. We located them. That's a material distinction. Driscoll looked at her. I know that. You know that. The question is whether Judge Carver will see it that way before the railroad's lawyers spend 3 hours arguing otherwise. Then we need to get in front of him before they do, Vivian said. We don't have that kind of access. Driscoll, Colton said. The lawyer stopped. Can you request an emergency hearing on the admissibility question before the main date? Driscoll was quiet for a moment. It's possible, he said. It depends on the docket, and it depends on whether the judge thinks the question warrants it. Make him think it does, Vivian said. She turned the motion document over and picked up the pencil that was always near her at the table now, and began writing something on the back of a blank page she pulled from the stack beside her. I'll write out the statutory argument. You file it with the request. 3 paragraphs. Specific, sourced, no generalities. She was already writing. The railroad's lawyers will write 12 pages of procedural argument. We write 3 paragraphs of law. Judges read short things more carefully than long ones. Driscoll watched her for a moment with an expression that had moved well past his initial careful reserve and was now something closer to genuine reliance. He wasn't accustomed to being told how to do his job in his own voice by someone who hadn't passed the bar. But he also wasn't, at his core, a proud man. He was a careful one, and careful men recognized useful counsel when it arrived, regardless of where it came from. All right, he said. She wrote. He watched. Colton got up and poured more coffee for everyone, and outside the sun moved across the Wyoming sky the way it always did, indifferent to the particular drama playing out under it. The emergency hearing was granted for the following Monday, 4 days before the main court date. The news came back through Driscoll on Friday afternoon, and it produced in the Hayes household the particular sensation of a door opening onto something that might be good or might be terrible, and not yet being able to see which. Colton told the children at dinner that there was going to be a court hearing in town on Monday, and that he and Miss Vivian would be going, and that May would stay with them for the day. Are we going to lose the ranch? Wyatt said. The table went very quiet. Owen stopped eating. Lily looked at her plate. Emma looked at Wyatt and then at her father with the expression of a child who has understood the emotional temperature of a room without understanding its content. Colton looked at his son. Wyatt was watching him with the directness he'd had since infancy. Eyes forward, no flinching from what he was asking, already braced for an answer he didn't want. No, Colton said. But it might happen, Wyatt said. It might happen, Colton said. But we're fighting it, and we have good reasons to think we'll win. Wyatt looked at Vivian. Is that true? Vivian met his look directly. She didn't soften it or qualify it the way adults sometimes did with children when they were trying to protect them from reasonable fear. We have the truth on our side, she said. That matters. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it matters more than people sometimes give it credit for. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Okay, in the same tone he'd used in the barn, deliberate, a concession, and picked up his fork again. Lily reached across the table and briefly touched Vivian's hand, once, without looking up from her plate. Then she went back to eating. It was such a small thing. It was the kind of thing you could miss if you were looking somewhere else. Colton wasn't looking somewhere else. The weekend before the hearing was the hardest stretch of waiting Colton could remember, which was saying something given the past 4 months. There was nothing more to prepare. Vivian had done everything that could be done, written everything that could be written, organized the documentation into a sequence that told its own story even before anyone presented it. The field notes, the provenance account, the rubbings from the stone markers, the statutory argument on admissibility. It was as complete as it was going to get. That left 2 days of existing in a house where the outcome was still uncertain, which turned out to be its own kind of difficult. Saturday morning, Vivian took Lily and Emma outside to the kitchen garden and spent 2 hours pulling the last of the winter weeds and turning the soil for planting. Colton watched from the barn doorway for a while, ostensibly repairing a harness that needed attention. Emma narrated everything she was doing in real time, which was her natural mode of operating, and Lily worked quietly beside Vivian and occasionally asked questions about which plants went where and why. Vivian answered each one with specificity. She knew gardens as well as she knew survey maps, apparently, which Colton filed away without comment. After a while, Wyatt drifted over from wherever he'd been and stood at the edge of the garden with his hands in his pockets. He didn't offer to help. He just stood there, and after a few minutes he crouched down and started pulling weeds from the row nearest to where Vivian was working, without saying anything about it. Vivian didn't make a thing of it. She just moved her work down the same row in his direction, and they worked in parallel for a while. And eventually Wyatt said, "What are you going to plant here?" And she told him, and that was all it took. Colton went back to the harness. He felt something in his chest that he didn't have an immediate name for. Not happiness, exactly, but something in the same territory. Something like the possibility of happiness. Deferred slightly, but present. Saturday evening was different. He found Vivian at the table after the children were in bed, and she wasn't working. She was sitting with her hands around her coffee cup and staring at nothing in particular. And when he came in, she looked up with the slightly startled expression of someone pulled out of something that had been consuming her. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. She didn't move. He sat down across from her. He'd started to notice that the most significant conversations they had happened at this table, in the evenings, when the house was quiet. He wasn't sure if that was because the quiet was necessary for the conversations, or because the conversations were what filled the quiet. "Tell me what you're worried about," he said. She looked at him. "Which part?" "The part you haven't said yet." She was quiet for a moment, turning the cup in her hands. "Victor Hale knows what we have," she said. "Or knows enough. He's not going to sit and wait for Monday's hearing to go against him." "What do you think he'll do?" "What men like him always do," she said. "He'll try to get ahead of it. Find a way to discredit the evidence before it gets in front of the judge." She looked at him directly. "Or discredit me." Colton held her gaze. "On what grounds?" "On whatever grounds he can manufacture." She set the cup down. "I worked for a man the railroad destroyed. I've been carrying evidence against them for 3 years. I arrived in this county 2 weeks before a court date on a case directly involving their land claims. If he can make that look like a scheme rather than what it actually is..." She stopped. "What is it actually?" he said. Not to challenge her, to hear her say it. She looked at him steadily. "Someone trying to fix something that was broken," she said, using the only tools she had. "Then that's what we say," he said. "Courts don't always want the truth," she said. "They want a coherent story, and the railroad's lawyers are very good at coherent stories." "So are you," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see the exhaustion in her face. Not just the exhaustion of this week, but the older exhaustion, the kind that had been living there since before she arrived, since before Laramie, since whatever had happened in the years between Edmund Carver's survey crew and the Redstone Station platform. He didn't know the full shape of it yet. He understood it was there. "I need you to trust me on Monday," she said, "when we're in that courtroom. If I say something or do something that seems..." She paused. "I need you to let me finish, even if it looks like it's going the wrong direction." "I trust you," he said. "You've trusted me for 2 weeks," she said. "That's not the same as trusting me in front of a judge with your land at stake." "Vivian," he said. He waited until she was looking at him. You've had those field notes for 3 years. You could have sold them. You could have traded them for a better position than a Laramie boarding house. You carried them here, in that suitcase, and you put them on my kitchen table. He kept his voice level. I trust you. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted. Not a dramatic change, more like a small piece of something that had been clenched, releasing slightly. She picked up her coffee cup again. All right, she said quietly. Get some sleep, he said. You too, she said. He went to bed. This time, he slept. Monday came gray and cold, the sky flat and low the way Wyoming skies got in late May when they were deciding whether to storm. Colton hitched the wagon at 6 in the morning, and Vivian came out at 6:30 in the only dress she had that was clearly intended for formal occasions, dark blue wool, plainly cut, worn at the collar, but still decent. She had the leather folder under her arm with the documentation organized inside, and she had her hair pinned up in a way that made her look older and more deliberate, and she climbed up onto the wagon without assistance and set the folder on her lap. The children were with May. The goodbyes had been brief. Lily had held Vivian's hand for a moment before letting go, and Emma had cried a little, and Wyatt had said, with the particular tone of a 6-year-old attempting dignity, "Bring the ranch back," which was not quite grammatically right and was somehow exactly right. "We will," Vivian had said. "I promise." It was the first promise she'd made to any of them directly. Colton had heard it. Wyatt had heard it. He'd stood a little straighter after she said it, which might have meant nothing and probably meant something. Redstone Station's courthouse was the largest building in town, which wasn't saying much. It was a 2-story frame structure with a false front and a single courtroom on the ground floor that doubled for town meetings and occasional traveling theater performances. It had the specific smell of institutional wood and old paper and the slight cold dampness of a building that was never quite warm enough. The room was more crowded than Colton expected. He understood immediately, looking at the rows of chairs and the people filling them, that word had gotten out, not just about the hearing, but about what the hearing involved. Redstone Station was a town of 400 people in a county of ranchers and homesteaders, and the Continental Western Railroad had been filing land claims in this county for 2 years. There were at least a dozen people in those chairs who had their own stakes in how this morning went, and probably more who were simply there because this was the most significant thing that had happened in Redstone Station in months. Victor Hale sat at the table on the right side of the courtroom with 2 men in suits that hadn't been bought in Wyoming. His face was arranged in the confident, faintly bored expression of someone who expects to prevail on procedure and has arranged everything accordingly. He looked at Vivian when she came in. His expression didn't change. That was what was careful about it. The non-change was deliberate, a decision not to react, which was itself a reaction. Driscoll met them near the door and leaned in close. "The railroad's lawyers filed an additional brief this morning," he said, "challenging your wife's standing to present evidence. They're arguing she has a personal history of conflict with Continental Western that compromises her credibility as a witness." Colton felt his jaw tighten. He looked at Vivian. She had already taken the new brief from Driscoll and was reading it. Her face was entirely calm, which he had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of focus. She finished reading, handed it back to Driscoll, and said, "The bias argument only holds if they can prove I fabricated the evidence. They can't prove that because I didn't. Let them raise it. It'll give us the opening to enter the full provenance account, which puts Carver's removal on the record." She looked at Driscoll. "That's better for us, not worse?" Driscoll stared at her for a beat. Then he said, "All right," and went to the table. Judge William Carver, no relation to Edmund, was a man in his early 60s with a gray beard and the permanent slight squint of someone who spent most of his career reading documents in poor light. He came in without ceremony, sat down, looked at both tables with equal and impersonal attention, and said, "We're here on a motion for admissibility. I'll hear arguments. Keep them brief. I've read the filings." The railroad's lead lawyer, a man named Prescott, who had the polished manner of someone trained in a city where polish was the default, stood up and delivered 12 minutes of argument about procedural timelines and the prejudicial nature of evidence disclosed after initial filing. He cited 4 cases, all from Eastern Territories. He was smooth and specific and spoke with the confidence of someone who had made this argument many times and won it. Then Driscoll stood up and spoke for 4 minutes and cited 2 statutes. And the argument he made, the argument Vivian had written, was clean enough that you could follow every step of it without effort. Fabricated evidence falls under Section 14. Evidence that predates the dispute does not. The field notes were 19 years old. The stone markers were 19 years old. The railroad's own land claim acknowledged the original survey's existence. Excluding evidence that predates the dispute would create a procedural doctrine with no statutory basis and no precedent in territorial law. Judge Carver listened. He looked at his desk while Driscoll spoke, which in Colton's experience of the man from prior town meetings meant he was paying close attention rather than dismissing what he was hearing. When Driscoll sat down, Prescott stood again and raised the bias argument. Vivian's personal history, her employment by a man who had been in conflict with the railroad, her alleged motivation in presenting evidence against a company that had ended her career. Your Honor, Driscoll said, before Judge Carver could speak, if the company wishes to raise the question of my client's witness credibility, we would welcome the opportunity to present the full account of her professional history, including the circumstances of Edmund Carver's removal from his position, circumstances that are directly material to the railroad's claim in this case. A short silence. Mr. Prescott, Judge Carver said, looking at the railroad's lawyer, do you wish to pursue the bias argument? Prescott looked at his papers. Something in the posture of the man shifted, almost imperceptibly. We believe the procedural question is sufficient, Your Honor, he said. Then we'll set the bias question aside, Judge Carver said. He looked at the documents in front of him. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to allow the evidence. The procedural argument doesn't hold water, and I won't exclude material that predates the dispute on that basis. He looked at both tables. However, given the nature of the physical evidence, I'm ordering an independent survey verification. Court-appointed surveyor will assess the stone markers within the next 48 hours. Main hearing proceeds as scheduled on Thursday. He looked over his glasses. Are there any questions? There were none. Independent surveyor was a man named George Pollard from the territorial office, and he arrived Tuesday morning with an assistant and a set of instruments and the efficient, no-nonsense manner of someone who had been pulled off another job to do this one. He was not hostile and he was not friendly. He was simply professional, which was the best thing he could be under the circumstances. Vivian rode out with him and the assistant and Colton, carrying her folder. She guided them to the first marker with the field notes open in her hand, reading coordinates the way someone reads a language they know well. Not translating, just understanding directly. Pollard watched her do it without comment, and when they reached the first marker and she crouched to show him the carving and then held the field note beside it, he crouched beside her and looked for a long time. The notation is original, he said, more to himself than to anyone. You can see the oxidation in the cuts. Yes, Vivian said, 19 years worth. Pollard looked at her. You worked surveys? For 4 years, she said. He nodded once, slowly. Then you know I have to verify everything independently, he said. I'm not saying I doubt it. I know, she said. That's why I want you to. He checked his instruments. He took measurements. He checked the measurements against the field notes and against the federal land grant and against a clean copy of the railroad's submitted map that he'd brought from the territorial office. He did it methodically and without haste, and Colton stood back and watched and felt the particular sensation of someone waiting for a verdict that has already been rendered but hasn't been spoken yet. The second marker took longer to reach. Pollard made Vivian stop twice so he could take additional triangulation readings before they moved on, which she accommodated without impatience. And when they got to the riverbank and found the second marker still half embedded in root growth. Exactly where her notes predicted, Pollard crouched down and looked at it for a solid 2 minutes without speaking. His assistant, who had been writing everything down, looked up and then looked at Pollard and then went back to writing. Pollard stood. He brushed dirt from his knees. He looked at the field notes and then at the marker and then at the railroad's map. And he looked at Vivian and he said, the railroad's submitted boundary is approximately 63 yards east of where it should be, based on the original survey reference point. Yes, Vivian said. That's not a transcription error, he said. That's a deliberate shift. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment. I'll have my report to the court by tomorrow afternoon, he said, and turned and started back toward the horses. And something in the set of his shoulders as he walked told Colton everything he needed to know about what that report was going to say. The news reached town before they did. This was the nature of small places. Information moved faster than horses, driven by the network of people who noticed things and talked to people who noticed other things. By the time Colton pulled the wagon up to Driscoll's office late Tuesday afternoon, there were already 2 ranchers waiting outside who had heard from someone who had heard from Pollard's assistant that the independent survey had found what it found. One of them was a man named Bert Faulkner, who ran cattle on the property east of the Hayes land and who had his own unresolved dispute with the railroad about a different stretch of boundary. He shook Colton's hand and looked at Vivian and said, "That true? The markers match the original notes?" "Every measurement," Colton said. Faulkner looked at Vivian for a long moment. Then he said, "What's your name, ma'am?" "Vivian Hayes," she said. He nodded, once, with the particular weight of a man deciding something. "All right," he said. "Then I'll be in the courtroom Thursday." By Wednesday, there were more. May Delaney reported it from her rounds through town. People were talking. Not the vague talking of rumor, but the more deliberate talking of people who are paying attention and thinking about what something might mean for them. 2 other families with pending railroad disputes had contacted Driscoll. A territorial newspaper correspondent who had come through on Tuesday for an unrelated story had stayed after hearing what was happening. Victor Hale, as best anyone could tell, had been in the telegraph office 3 times since Monday. "He's trying to get someone to intervene from above," Driscoll said, sitting at the table Wednesday evening. "Above the court level, above the territorial level, if he can manage it." "Can he?" Colton said. "In time? Possibly," Driscoll said. "Not by Thursday." Vivian looked at the table. "He might try to have the hearing delayed," she said. "On what grounds?" "On any grounds he can file before 9 o'clock Thursday morning," she said. She looked up. "We need to make sure we're in that courtroom before they file anything." Driscoll nodded. "I'll be there at 8. 7:30? Vivian said. "Can you be there at 7:30? He looked at her. "Yes," he said. Wednesday night was the hardest night. Colton knew it was hard for him, but he understood it was harder for Vivian in a way he couldn't fully see. She had been carrying this, the notes, the waiting, the specific patient readiness for a moment that kept not arriving, for 3 years. Tomorrow was 3 years coming to a point. That was its own kind of weight. He found her outside after the children were in bed, standing at the fence at the edge of the yard, looking out at the dark flat of the property. The night was clear, colder than the days had been, and the stars were sharp overhead the way they got when the air was dry. He went and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said finally. "Don't," she said. "Vivian, don't finish that sentence," she said. "Not sharp, just certain. Whatever happens tomorrow is not an acceptable beginning. We're going to win tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "I've gone over everything twice more," she said. "The statutory argument is sound. Pollard's report will be in before the hearing starts. Driscoll knows the sequence." She said all of this to the dark flat of the land rather than to him. "We have the truth, and we have the physical evidence, and we have an honest judge. That should be enough." "Should be," he said. "It has to be," she said. He stood beside her in the dark. After a moment he said, "Wyatt asked me tonight if you were going to stay." She was quiet. "I told him yes," he said. She turned to look at him, and in the starlight her expression was unguarded in a way that was different from most of how he'd seen her. The careful, focused competence had dropped back for a moment, and what was underneath it was something more uncertain, more searching. "Is that still what you want?" she said. "After all of this, after knowing how I came here." He looked at her. He thought about the kitchen table the first night, and the suitcase full of field notes, and the way she'd let Emma climb on her lap without making anything of it, and the way she'd talked to Wyatt in the barn, and the way she'd said we're going to win tomorrow with a certainty she was holding together through sheer force of will. "Yes," he said. "That's still what I want." She nodded, once. She turned back to look at the land. "Your father built something worth keeping," she said quietly. "We're going to keep it," he said. She didn't answer, but she didn't move away either, and they stood there together in the dark for a while, looking out over the Hayes land. 19 years of work and grief and growing things and holding on. And the night was very still. Thursday morning arrived with the gray-pink light of a day trying to clear. By the time Colton and Vivian reached the courthouse at 7:25, Driscoll was already there, and he was not alone. Bert Faulkner was there, and the Crenshaw family from the North Range, and a woman named Dorothy Marsh, whose husband had lost 40 acres to a railroad claim the previous fall, and who had driven 17 miles on her own in the dark to be present. The correspondent from the territorial newspaper stood near the door with a notebook. The courtroom filled in a way that Redstone Station courtrooms almost never filled. Victor Hale arrived at 8:45 with Prescott and the second lawyer and 3 additional men. Colton didn't recognize men who had the particular look of people brought in for emphasis rather than function. Hale scanned the room when he entered, and his expression, which had been composed, shifted slightly. He had not expected this many people. He looked at Vivian. She was seated at the plaintiff's table, the leather folder closed in front of her hands flat on the table, her posture perfectly still. She met his look without expression and held it until he looked away. Judge Carver came in at 9 o'clock precisely. He sat. He looked at the room, at the packed seats, at both tables, at the correspondent with the notebook. His expression gave nothing away. "The matter before this court," he said, "is the Continental Western Railroad's claim against the Hayes property, contested eastern boundary. I have reviewed Mr. Pollard's verification report, which was received this morning." He paused. He looked at both tables with equal deliberateness. "Mr. Prescott, does the railroad wish to enter any additional argument before I issue my ruling on the boundary question?" Prescott stood. He spoke for 7 minutes. The argument was skilled and extensive and ultimately rested on the position that field notes of uncertain provenance, combined with physical markers whose age could not be independently verified to the requisite standard, did not constitute sufficient grounds to overturn an official territorial survey document bearing the company's seal. He sat down. "Mr. Driscoll," Judge Carver said. Driscoll stood. He opened his mouth. "Actually," Judge Carver said, "I'd like to hear from Mrs. Hayes." A ripple went through the room. Prescott looked up sharply. Driscoll sat down slowly, glancing at Vivian. She stood. She stood the way she did everything, without haste, without performance. She opened the leather folder in front of her and extracted the documentation in the order it was meant to be read, and she looked at Judge Carver, and she spoke. She told him about Edmund Carver. "No relation," she said, and the judge's expression flickered slightly. She told him about 4 years of survey work, about the original Hayes property survey, about the approach Continental Western had made to alter the records and Carver's refusal, about the systematic destruction of the original documentation and the copies she had preserved. She told him about the specific reference point discrepancy, the statutory language that made the discrepancy non-interpretive, and the physical markers that had been sitting in the ground for 19 years waiting for someone to look for them. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform emotion. She laid one thing after another in front of the judge, the way you build something solid, each piece supporting the next, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Judge Carver looked at the documentation. He looked at George Pollard's report. He looked at Vivian, who was still standing with her hands resting lightly on the folder, and then he looked at Victor Hale, who was looking at the table in front of him. "Mr. Hale," Judge Carver said. Hale looked up. "The survey reference point," Judge Carver said. "Your company's submitted map uses a different baseline than the federal land grant specifies." He held up both documents side by side, briefly, then set them down. "Can you explain that discrepancy?" Hale looked at Prescott. Prescott looked at his papers. "The company's surveyor," Prescott began. "I asked Mr. Hale," Judge Carver said. The room held its breath. Victor Hale, who had walked into the Hayes kitchen 3 weeks ago, with the ease of a man who had never been told no in a way that lasted, looked at Judge William Carver across a courtroom full of ranchers and neighbors and a newspaper correspondent with a notebook, and he said nothing. The silence was its own answer, and everyone in that room heard it. Judge Carver let the silence sit for a full 5 seconds. That was not an accident. Colton had watched enough men in authority to know the difference between a silence that happened and a silence that was placed, deliberately, with full awareness of what it would do to the room. Judge Carver set that silence down in front of Victor Hale like an object and let everyone in the courtroom look at it. Then he said, The court will recess for 30 minutes. He stood and left through the side door and the room exhaled. What followed was not orderly. The packed rows of ranchers and neighbors did not sit quietly in their chairs and wait. They turned to each other, and the sound of 30 people talking in low, urgent voices filled the space immediately, and Colton felt it rather than heard it, a kind of collective pressure change. Bert Faulkner caught his eye from across the room and gave a single nod, the kind that meant something definite without being specific. Dorothy Marsh was holding her handkerchief with both hands, and not using it, just holding it. At the railroad's table, Prescott had leaned close to Hale and was speaking in a fast, low voice. Hale was not looking at him. He was looking at the surface of the table with the expression of a man recalculating. Not panicking, not yet, but recalculating, which meant he still believed there was something to calculate toward. That was the part that worried Colton. He leaned toward Driscoll. "He's not done," he said quietly. Driscoll looked at the railroad's table. "No," he said. "He's not." Vivian was gathering the documentation back into the folder with careful hands, and she spoke without looking up. "Prescott will request a continuance during the recess," she said. "He'll ask for more time to respond to the independent survey report. Standard delay tactic when the procedural ground has shifted." "Can Carver deny it?" "He can and probably will," she said. "The report was filed within the court-ordered timeline. There's no procedural basis for additional delay." She straightened the last page and closed the folder. "But Prescott will ask anyway, because that's what you do when you're running out of options. You make the other side wait as long as possible and hope something changes." She looked at Colton then, and he looked at her, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that something changing was exactly the thing they couldn't afford. The 30 minutes passed the way. Waiting always passes when the outcome matters. Slower than normal time, thick with the specific awareness of every minute. Colton stood near the window with Vivian beside him, and outside the courthouse, the street of Redstone Station went about its ordinary morning, which felt strange to observe. A wagon went by. A woman came out of the dry goods store with a parcel. The world was not holding its breath the way the courtroom was. May Delaney appeared in the doorway at the 20-minute mark. Colton straightened when he saw her. She had left the children with her neighbor, an older woman named Ruth, who watched children for emergencies, and she'd apparently driven herself to town the moment she could get away. She came in and found them by the window and looked at Vivian and said, without preamble, "How does it stand?" "The judge recessed," Vivian said. "We think the ruling will go our way, but Prescott will push for a delay." May looked at the railroad's table, where Hale and Prescott were still in their close, fast conversation. Her expression did what it usually did, which was give nothing away while clearly forming a complete opinion. "That man," she said, meaning Hale, without specifying what about him. "Yes," Vivian said. May turned back and looked at Vivian with the directness she'd been measuring out since the day Vivian arrived. Never hostile, but never freely given either. She said, "You did well up there." Vivian looked slightly surprised. "The judge hasn't ruled yet." "I'm not talking about the ruling," May said. "I'm talking about what you said and how you said it." She paused. "I've known Colton Hayes since he was 4 years old, and his mother used to bring him to my kitchen for sugar biscuits because they didn't have enough money for good flour that month. I've watched that family hold on through things that would have broken most people." She glanced at Colton and then back at Vivian. "He needed someone who could stand up in that room and say the truth and make it hold. You did that." It was from May Delaney, the equivalent of a lengthy declaration of affection. Vivian understood that. She'd spent enough time around the woman to understand what her economies meant. She said, "Thank you, May," simply, without making more of it. May sat down in the nearest chair and crossed her arms and settled in to wait, which was also, from May, a kind of statement. When Judge Carver came back, Prescott was on his feet before the man had fully settled into his chair. "Your Honor, the railroad requests a 30-day continuance to prepare a proper response to the independent survey report." "Denied," Judge Carver said. Prescott kept going as if the word hadn't landed. "The report raises significant technical questions that our surveyors have not had adequate time to—" "Mr. Prescott," Judge Carver said, in the tone of a man who has already made a decision and is waiting for everyone else to finish talking so he can deliver it. "The independent survey was court-ordered. The timeline was established by this court. The report was filed on time and according to those terms. A continuance request on the basis of inadequate preparation time is not well-founded when your client has had access to these proceedings from the beginning. He looked at Prescott with the patience of someone who had been a judge for long enough that impatience was no longer useful. Is there anything else? Prescott sat down. Judge Carver looked at both tables. He placed his hands flat on the desk in front of him, which Colton noticed as the same gesture Vivian used at the kitchen table when she was about to say something she'd made up her mind about completely. The Continental Western Railroad's claim rests on a boundary survey that this court has now established uses a reference baseline inconsistent with the original federal land grant, Judge Carver said. That inconsistency is not minor, and it is not, as the company has suggested, an interpretive variation. The federal land grant language is specific. The original survey notation preserved in the field notes presented by Mrs. Hayes and corroborated by the physical markers verified by this court's appointed surveyor establishes the correct boundary with precision. He paused. The railroad's claim is dismissed. The room came apart. It didn't erupt. It wasn't a sudden explosion of sound. It was more like a structure giving way, something that had been held under pressure releasing all at once. Colton heard voices around him and felt a hand on his arm that turned out to be May. And across the room he saw Dorothy Marsh press her handkerchief to her face, and Bert Faulkner said something to the man next to him, and the man nodded vigorously. Driscoll was saying something to him, but he couldn't quite hear it yet. Vivian was still. She was sitting at the table with the folder in front of her and her hands flat on either side of it, and she was looking at the judge's bench. Not at anyone in particular, just at the space where the ruling had come from. And her expression was something he hadn't seen on her before. Not triumph. Not relief exactly, though relief was in it somewhere. It was more like the face of someone who has been bracing for impact for a very long time and has just been told they can stop. He put his hand on her shoulder. Just that. She reached up without looking and covered his hand with hers, briefly, and then let go and looked around the room with a different expression. The practical one, coming back online, already thinking about what came next. Driscoll, she said. Driscoll leaned in. The other families, she said. Faulkner, the Crenshaws, Dorothy Marsh. If this ruling is on the record, does it set precedent for the other disputed claims? Not automatically, Driscoll said. But it creates the evidentiary basis. If the railroad used the same altered reference baseline across multiple surveys, they did, she said. I have notes on 3 others. Different properties, same baseline shift. She looked at him. Same folder. Driscoll stared at her. I brought everything I had, she said. I wasn't sure how much we'd need. Victor Hale left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. That was notable. Not because Colton expected an apology or a confrontation, but because Hale was not, by nature, a man who retreated quietly. He was the kind of man who always had something to say, who managed exits the way he managed entrances, with full awareness of the impression he was creating. Walking out of that courtroom with his lawyers and his city-bought suits, and saying nothing to nobody, was the loudest thing he'd done all morning. Colton watched him go. He felt something that he wanted to call satisfaction, but that was actually more complicated than that. There was satisfaction in it, yes, but there was also the particular exhaustion of someone who has been frightened for a long time, and has stopped being frightened and is now feeling the weight of all that fear leaving at once. It was heavier going out than it had been coming in, somehow. He found Vivian in conversation with Bert Faulkner near the courtroom door, and when he got close enough to hear, she was explaining the baseline reference discrepancy to Faulkner and a woman he didn't know, speaking with the patient precision of someone who had explained this 100 times and was willing to explain it 100 more. Faulkner was leaning forward with his arms crossed and his expression intent, and the woman beside him had pulled out a folded paper from her coat that looked like a property document. He didn't interrupt. He stood back and watched his wife work. They didn't leave for the ranch until mid-afternoon. Driscoll needed time with the other families, preliminary conversations about the other disputed claims, the possibility of using the field notes as a foundation for additional challenges. Vivian sat with him and the families in a side room off the courthouse for almost 2 hours, going through the documentation page by page. And Colton spent that time outside on the courthouse steps in the spring sun, talking to neighbors and not talking to neighbors in roughly equal measure. May came out and sat beside him at one point. They didn't talk for a while. She's in there with Driscoll and 5 families, Colton said eventually. I know, May said. She brought documentation on 3 other cases, he said. May looked at him sideways. In that same suitcase? The same folder she carried into the courtroom this morning. May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Colton. Yeah. When she came off that train, May said, I thought you'd made a terrible mistake. I know, he said. I thought she'd be trouble, May said. Not bad trouble, not that kind. Just more than you could handle on top of everything else. He looked at her. I was wrong, May said, with the specific directness of a woman who doesn't admit that easily and means it when she does. Not about the trouble part. She is trouble, but it's the right kind. He thought about that. Is there a right kind? There's trouble that tears things down and trouble that builds them back up, May said. Only looked like the first kind because she arrived in a coat with a hole in it. She stood up with the slight effort of a woman in her 60s who had driven to town in a hurry and been sitting on hard chairs for hours. Your children need to know it's over. Don't stay too late. She went to get her wagon, and Colton sat on the courthouse steps in the afternoon sun and thought about a coat with a hole in it and what you could miss if you were looking at the hole instead of the person wearing it. When they finally headed back to the ranch, the sun was angled low, and the light was that amber gold that made the Wyoming plains look, briefly, like somewhere that had always been easy to live in, which it wasn't, but the light didn't care about accuracy. Vivian sat beside him on the wagon with the leather folder on her lap, and her head tilted back slightly, eyes closed, which was the first time he'd seen her do something that looked purely like rest. The folder was still there, she hadn't let go of it, but the grip was loose, the way you hold something when the emergency is over but the habit of holding it hasn't caught up yet. They rode without speaking for a while. The horse knew the way home. What Driscoll said about the other cases, Colton said eventually. She opened her eyes. Are you going to help them? She considered the road for a moment. If they want the documentation, it's theirs, she said. I've been carrying it long enough. She paused. Whether I'm directly involved depends on what's useful. You'd be useful, he said. Maybe. She looked at the road. I don't need to be the person in the courtroom every time. Today was specific. This land, this case. The others can be handled differently. He looked at her profile. The particular set of her jaw, the slight lines around her eyes that came from years of squinting at measurement documents in outdoor light. What do you want? He said. Not what's useful. What do you actually want? She was quiet for long enough that he started to think she wasn't going to answer. I want to plant the garden, she said. The one Lily and I started on Saturday. I want to finish turning that south row and get the beans in before the ground warms too fast. She paused. I want Wyatt to stop watching me like he's waiting for me to leave. He felt something move in his chest. He'll stop, he said. I know, she said. I'm just saying it's what I want. She looked at him. I want Emma to keep climbing on my lap without asking. I want to teach Owen to read a survey map because he's going to be very good at it. He has the kind of mind that likes systems. A slight pause. I want the fence on the east boundary fixed properly now that we know where the east boundary actually is. That's a lot of wants, he said. I've been in a boarding house for 18 months, she said. I've had time to accumulate them. He looked back at the road. Those all sound like things a person does when they're staying somewhere, he said. Yes, she said. They do. The children were on the porch when the wagon came up the lane, which was the same as when Vivian had arrived 6 weeks ago, but different in a way that was hard to articulate and completely clear. They weren't arranged in a line. They were clustered, Emma sitting on the porch rail with her legs swinging, Owen standing beside her mid-sentence about something, Lily on the step below watching the wagon come in, Wyatt leaning against the post with his arms at his sides rather than crossed. May's neighbor Ruth waved from the doorway and went inside, apparently satisfied that the adults had returned and her responsibility was discharged. The wagon stopped. Colton climbed down first and then turned to offer his hand to Vivian, who took it. She had the folder under her other arm. Emma launched herself off the porch rail, which she was not supposed to do, and crossed the yard at full speed and threw herself at Vivian with the complete physical confidence of a 3-year-old who has decided someone belongs to her. Vivian caught her, absorbed the impact without staggering, which was a feat, and held her without making a production of it. Did you win? Emma said from about 2 inches away. We won, Vivian said. Emma pulled back to look at her face, apparently verifying. Then she said, good, with great satisfaction, and immediately tried to climb further up, and Vivian shifted her to her hip and turned toward the porch. Owen came down the steps fast. Was there arguing in the court? Did Driscoll argue? Did you argue? There was arguing, Colton said. Who won the arguing? Miss Vivian did, Colton said. Owen turned to Vivian with an expression of fierce, uncomplicated pride that was so immediate and genuine it was almost hard to look at. I knew it, he said. I told Lily. I said she'd be the one to win it. You said you hoped, Lily said, coming down the steps with her characteristic quietness. She stopped in front of Vivian and Emma, looked up, and said, I'm glad. Me too, Vivian said. Lily nodded once, then stepped to the side. That was Lily, not less feeling than the others, but more precise about where she put it. Wyatt hadn't moved from the porch post. Colton looked at his son. Wyatt was looking at Vivian, had been looking at her since the wagon came into the yard, with an expression that Colton had not seen on his face before, and that took him a moment to identify. It wasn't the measuring, withholding look of the past 6 weeks. It wasn't the careful politeness of a child managing his own skepticism. It was something that had dropped all the management and was just looking. Vivian glanced up from Emma and found him. They looked at each other for a moment, the quiet mail-order bride who had been carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of patient waiting, and the 6-year-old who had been carrying the weight of his mother's absence and his own fear that something else he'd begun to rely on might leave. And neither of them said anything. Then Wyatt came down the porch steps, slowly, and crossed the yard, and stopped in front of her. He looked at the folder under her arm. He looked at her face. He looked at Emma, who was still on her hip and watching him with the simple interest of a 3-year-old observing something she doesn't fully understand. You kept your promise, he said. Yes, Vivian said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific deliberateness of a 6-year-old doing something he's decided to do and is going to do completely, he reached out and took hold of one end of the leather folder, just held it, the way you hold something you want to carry for someone. I can take that inside, he said. She looked at him. She looked at the folder, which she had not released since she picked it up in the courtroom that morning, which she had not let go of in various forms for 3 years. She looked at her stepson, this boy who had crossed his arms and sat on a bucket in the barn and watched her with the careful, injured suspicion of someone who'd been hurt enough to stop trusting. And she let go of the folder. He took it with both hands, carefully. He turned and went back up the porch steps and into the house, and the screen door banged behind him. Colton had to look away for a moment. Owen didn't notice because Owen was already asking him something about whether the judge had worn a special hat. But Lily noticed. Lily always noticed. And she looked at her father with those watchful, understanding eyes of hers and didn't say anything, because she was Lily and she didn't need to. That evening, May came back with a pot of beef stew and the particular air of someone doing a practical thing to avoid doing a sentimental one. She set it on the stove and started heating it without being asked, and Lily got the bowls and Owen set the table and Emma told Vivian in exhaustive detail about everything that had happened during the day. The mud she had found behind the barn, a bird Ruth had identified for her, a disagreement she'd had with Owen about something she couldn't quite articulate but felt strongly about. Wyatt put the leather folder on the shelf in the hallway, between the almanac and the family record book, which was where the family kept things that mattered. Colton noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He sat down to supper with his family. All of them, May included, crowded around the kitchen table that had seen so many of the significant moments of the past 6 weeks. And the stew was hot, and the bread was fresh from May's kitchen, and Emma kept leaning against Vivian's arm, and Wyatt ate his entire bowl and asked for more, which he hadn't been doing lately. After supper, when the children were doing the dishes with the negotiated division of labor that had evolved over the past few weeks, May sat down across from Vivian with her coffee and said, without setup, Driscoll mentioned there might be other cases. There might be, Vivian said. He said you have documentation on 3 other disputed properties in the county. I do. May looked at her. Are you planning to do this again? Go through what you went through today for other families? Vivian considered her coffee cup. The documentation exists, she said. It seems wasteful not to use it. That's not what I asked, May said. Vivian looked up. Yes, she said. If there are families who need it and a court that will hear it, yes, I'm planning to help. May was quiet for a moment. You're going to need something to do it properly, she said. Not just the notes. You're going to need someone who knows the territorial legal system, someone with access to the courts. Driscoll is one man with one practice, May said. I'm talking about something more organized. She wrapped both hands around her cup. My husband, he's been dead 12 years. He was a territorial land commissioner. I still have contacts in the commission office. She paused, in the way of someone putting something down that they've been carrying for a while. I haven't used them for anything, haven't had reason to. She looked at Vivian steadily. I might have reason now. Vivian looked at her. Don't make a thing of it, May said immediately. I'm not making a thing of it, Vivian said. Good, May said. She drank her coffee. Colton, who had been listening from the doorway, turned and went back into the kitchen and didn't say anything about it to either of them, because they clearly had it handled. Later that night, after the children were in bed and May had gone home and the house was quiet, Colton and Vivian sat at the kitchen table again. The field notes were in the hallway now, on the shelf where Wyatt had put them. The table was just a table. I want to fix the sign at the gate, Colton said. She looked at him. What sign? My father put a board up when he filed the claim. It just has the property name, Hayes Land. He said he'd put something proper when the place was established enough to say something about. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It was never quite established enough in his mind. Then he was gone. Vivian was quiet, listening. I want to put something up now, he said. Something real. She looked at the table for a moment. What would you say? He thought about it. He'd been thinking about it, actually, for a few days. Not consciously, but the way you think about something when it's been working at the back of your mind without announcing itself. Something about what we built here, he said. What this place actually is. She looked at him. Every promise honored, she said quietly. He looked at her. She shook her head slightly. Something Edmund Carver used to say. He had a belief that if you honored every commitment you made, every measurement, every notation, every agreement with the land and with the people on it, you built something that couldn't be taken. She paused. He was idealistic. He was also right. Every promise honored, Colton said, becomes the foundation of a stronger family, she said. That was the second part. He used to say it when we finished a survey and everything had checked out. When the numbers were right and the markers were where they should be and the land was correctly represented. She looked at the table. I haven't thought about that in a long time. He looked at her across the kitchen table. The same lamplight, the same Wyoming night pressing against the windows. And he thought about 6 weeks ago when she'd stepped off a train and apologized for not being what he expected. You were always what I needed, he said. I just didn't know what I needed yet. She looked at him with that expression he'd come to know, the one where the careful competence dropped back for a moment, and what was underneath it was something more uncertain and more real. That's a generous interpretation, she said. It's an accurate one, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them burned steady and even, and outside the Wyoming night held everything in its particular dark. And down the hall, Wyatt slept with his arms uncrossed for the first time in months, and Lily's watchful eyes were closed, and Owen was dreaming something that was probably about arguing in courtrooms, and Emma had her hand tucked under her chin the way she always slept. Colton, Vivian said. Yeah. She didn't say anything else immediately. She looked at the table and then at the doorway where the field notes sat on the shelf, and then at him. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet and even. Thank you, she said, for keeping your promise. On the platform. When everyone was watching, and it would have been easy not to. He held her gaze. You've said that before. I know, she said. It bears repeating. He didn't answer that. He refilled her coffee cup and she didn't stop him, and they sat there in the kitchen of the Hayes Ranch, with the night around them and the morning coming, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else, because some things don't need saying once they've already been made true. The beans went in the following Saturday. Vivian and Lily worked the south row together in the early morning before the sun got high enough to be uncomfortable, and Owen came out to help and mostly asked questions about soil depth, and Emma sat at the edge of the garden and provided commentary on everyone's technique, which nobody had asked for and which she provided freely regardless. Wyatt appeared at some point with the small hand spade that had been hanging in the barn since their mother's time, and he gave it to Vivian without explanation and then stayed to help her use it, and nobody made anything of that either. Colton watched from the fence for a while. He had fence posts to set on the east boundary, the actual east boundary now, the one that had been established correctly and verified by a court-appointed surveyor and entered into territorial record. The work felt different than it had 2 weeks ago. Not easier. The posts were the same weight, and the ground was the same ground, but different in the way that doing something permanent feels different from doing something temporary. He was setting posts that would stand where they were supposed to stand, on land that was unambiguously his, and the difference between that and what he'd been living with for 4 months was something he hadn't found the right words for yet and wasn't sure he needed to. He set the posts and listened to the sounds from the garden. Emma's running commentary, Lily's quieter voice asking Vivian something he couldn't quite hear, Owen launching into what sounded like a theory about whether certain vegetables had preferences. And he thought about what May had said on the courthouse steps. The right kind of trouble. He thought she was right. He also thought the right kind of trouble was still trouble, and that this was not over in the way that some endings were over. The railroad had lost one case. They still existed. Victor Hale still existed. The documentation Vivian had in that folder covered 3 other disputed properties in the county, and those families still had unresolved claims, and the work of getting those claims properly heard was going to require time and effort and the particular patient courage of people willing to stand up and say what was true, even when the people on the other side had more money and more lawyers and more institutional weight. That work was not done. But today was Saturday, and the beans were going in, and that was enough to stand in front of and feel grateful for. The first of the other cases went to court 6 weeks later. It was the Faulkner property, Bert's eastern boundary claim, which the railroad had been pushing on for 14 months before the Hayes ruling gave him the standing to challenge it. Driscoll filed on his behalf, using the same statutory argument Vivian had constructed, and the field notes that covered the Faulkner survey specifically. Vivian prepared the documentation package with the same thoroughness she'd brought to their own case, and she sat beside Driscoll at the plaintiff's table when the hearing came, not as the primary voice, but as the person who knew the evidence in the way that only its keeper could. The railroad sent different lawyers this time. Not Prescott. Prescott had apparently been reassigned or had removed himself, which amounted to the same thing. The new team was competent and well-prepared and significantly more careful about the baseline reference question, having clearly been briefed on exactly where the previous case had fallen apart. It took 2 hearings instead of 1. The railroad contested the admissibility of Vivian's field notes with a more sophisticated argument than Prescott had managed, and Judge Carver allowed more back and forth before ruling. Vivian sat through it with the patience of someone who has already survived the harder version of something and knows it. Bert Faulkner won. The ruling came down on a Tuesday afternoon, and Bert shook Colton's hand outside the courthouse and then turned to Vivian and said, "I don't know how to thank you." And she said, "You don't need to. Just use the land well." And he looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who understands he's been helped by someone who didn't have to help him, and then he nodded and walked to his horse and rode home to tell his family. Dorothy Marsh's case was more complicated. Her husband had signed a document before he died, a document that the railroad had presented as a preliminary sale agreement, which if valid would have superseded any boundary dispute entirely. The document's legitimacy was questionable on several grounds, and Vivian spent 3 weeks working through the legal arguments with Driscoll and increasingly with May's contact at the Territorial Land Commission, a man named Aldrich who had been a colleague of May's husband and who had, it turned out, been watching the Continental Western Railroad's land practices with growing professional concern for the better part of 2 years. Aldrich was the thing that changed the scale. He was not, individually, more powerful than the railroad, but he was connected in the particular way of a man who had spent 20 years in territorial administration. He knew judges, he knew land commissioners in 3 other territories. He knew the federal land office officials who had originally processed the grants that the railroad surveys were supposed to be based on. When Vivian sat down with him the first time and showed him the field notes and walked him through the baseline reference discrepancy, he looked at the documentation for a long time without speaking and then looked at her and said, "How many surveys did Continental Western file in this territory in the past 8 years. I've identified documentation covering 14 properties, she said, but I only have complete field notes for 6 of them. Aldrich was quiet. The other 8, he said. Could the same pattern apply? Almost certainly, she said. He looked at the folder. Mrs. Hayes, he said, I think this is larger than a county court. She looked at him. I know, she said. I've known for 3 years. I needed a place to start. Dorothy Marsh won her case in September. The document the railroad had presented was found to be signed under conditions that the territorial court would not recognize as free consent, given that Dorothy's husband had been severely ill at the time of signing and without independent counsel. The ruling was narrow. It didn't go as far as Vivian had argued for, but it was enough. Dorothy kept her land. She drove out to the Hayes Ranch the day after the ruling with a jar of preserved peaches and a letter she'd written and then rewritten several times, and she sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and didn't give Vivian the letter because she said it was too long and she felt silly about it, and Vivian said she'd like to read it anyway, and Dorothy gave it to her, and then had to look out the window for a while. Emma climbed onto Dorothy's lap without being invited, which she had begun doing to anyone who sat at the table long enough, and Dorothy held her automatically and kept looking out the window with her jaw set in the particular way of someone holding something together on purpose. My husband would have, Dorothy started. I know, Vivian said. He should have been there to see it. Yes, Vivian said. He should have been. They sat with that for a while. Some things didn't resolve into something better. They just became part of what was true, and you carried them, and that was the whole of it. Vivian understood this in the specific way of someone who had also carried things she couldn't put down, and she didn't try to improve the moment into something it wasn't. Dorothy left an hour later with Emma's handprint somehow on her coat, which Emma had applied while Dorothy wasn't paying attention using dirt from the garden, and Dorothy laughed about it on the porch in a way that was also almost crying, and then she got in her wagon and went home to her land. In October, Aldrich filed a formal complaint with the Federal Land Office. It cited 14 Continental Western Railroad surveys in the territory, identified the systematic baseline reference shift, and requested a full federal audit of all railroad land claims filed in the region over the past decade. The complaint attached, as supporting evidence, the field notes of Edmund Carver's original survey crew, documented, provenanced, corroborated by independent verification in the Hayes case, and subsequently in 2 others. The railroad's response was immediate and aggressive. They filed counter-complaints. They challenged Aldrich's authority. They wrote letters to people with enough political weight to write back. For 3 weeks in November, it looked like the whole thing might get buried under institutional weight the way things often did when a company with enough money decided to be immovable. What they hadn't counted on was the territorial newspaper. The correspondent who had been in the Redstone Station courthouse on the day of the Hayes ruling had written a story. It had run in the territorial paper in June after the ruling, a factual account, careful and sourced, describing the case and its outcome. He had followed up with a second piece after the Faulkner ruling. By November, when the federal complaint became public, he was writing a third, and this one went beyond Redstone Station. The story of Vivian Hayes, the mail-order bride with the surveyor's field notes in her battered suitcase, who had arrived in a county under siege by a railroad company, and over the course of a summer helped dismantle the legal mechanism those seizures depended on, turned out to be the kind of story that traveled. It ran in 4 papers by December. A congressman from the territory included a reference to the federal complaint in a floor statement. The Federal Land Office, which had been deliberating, announced a formal audit. Vivian read about all of this in the newspaper, sitting at the kitchen table, with the particular expression of someone receiving news about something they started, and that has grown past the point where they can fully account for it. She was not unmoved, but she was also visibly, slightly unsettled by it. The distance between what she had done, which was specific and practical and rooted in a particular piece of land and a particular family, and what was being written about it, which was larger and more symbolic than she entirely recognized in herself. Colton read the December piece over her shoulder and said, "That's you." "It's a version of events," she said. "It's accurate," he said. "It's incomplete," she said. "It doesn't mention that I dropped the documentation twice on the way into the Faulkner hearing and had to pick it up off the courthouse floor while everyone watched. It doesn't mention that I wasn't sure the Marsh ruling was going to go our way until the judge actually spoke." She turned the page. People want a cleaner story than what actually happened. Maybe, he said, but the thing that actually happened was still enough. She looked up at him. He was standing behind her with his coffee, reading the paper over her shoulder, and there was something domestic and unguarded about the moment. The two of them in the kitchen on a December morning, the children still asleep, the light coming in flat and gray through the window the way winter light did. Yes, she said, it was enough. Wyatt learned to read a survey map that winter. It started because he found the field notes on the hallway shelf and brought them to Vivian and asked her to explain what the numbers meant. He'd been wondering since the night she'd put them on the kitchen table, and he'd pretended to be asleep but hadn't been. She sat down with him and went through the basic principles, and he asked questions that were sharp enough that she moved from basic to intermediate without really deciding to. And by the end of the first afternoon, he could identify a baseline reference notation and understood why it mattered. He was 7 by then. The crossed arms had mostly gone. He still had opinions about everything and expressed them without particular concern for whether anyone wanted to hear them, which was a quality that would either serve him very well or create tremendous problems depending on the context, and probably both. He had a habit of appearing at Vivian's elbow when she was working on something, not asking for attention, just placing himself nearby with the air of someone who wants to learn by proximity. She had stopped noticing it consciously, which meant she'd started treating it as simply what was normal, which was its own kind of thing. Owen, as predicted, turned out to have an extraordinary aptitude for systems. He learned the survey notation faster than Wyatt, though with less intuitive feel for what the numbers meant physically. Wyatt could look at a set of measurements and develop a sense of the land they described, while Owen could perform the calculations with a fluency that was almost mathematical. They were different kinds of understanding, and Vivian told them both, at different times, that neither was more valuable than the other, and that the best surveyors she'd known had both. Lily absorbed everything quietly, in her way. She didn't ask to learn the way Wyatt had, but she was always present when the learning was happening. And one afternoon in February, she showed Colton a map she'd drawn of the ranch property from memory, with the correct boundary markers indicated and the measurements notated in the right format. She had taught herself by watching, which was so completely Lily that he didn't know whether to be surprised or simply accept it as who she was. Emma was 5 by spring and had a different set of priorities, which mostly involved negotiating with the family's new dog, a large, undisciplined animal that Owen had lobbied for and won, and conducting what she described as scientific experiments in the garden, which were not scientific and were also not technically authorized, but the garden survived them mostly. The new gate sign went up in March, on a Thursday, which was no particular reason except that Thursday was when the wood was ready and the weather was clear enough to work. Colton had made it himself, carved from a good piece of cedar he'd been aging in the barn, wide enough to read from the road, with the letters cut deep so they'd hold in the Wyoming weather. He'd gotten the words right on the 3rd try, which was one more try than he'd have liked, but one fewer than he'd feared. He put it up in the morning before the children were out, because he'd wanted to do the work itself quietly. By the time everyone came out of the house, the sign was hung, and he was standing at the gate looking at it with the critical eye of someone assessing a thing he'd made and trying to decide if it said what he'd meant. Vivian came out first. She stood beside him and read it. Hayes Land. Every promise honored. She was quiet for a moment. You kept the second part, she said. I kept the part that was true, he said. She looked at the sign for another moment, and the morning light was on her face, and she looked like someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey and is still working out what it means that they are actually here. Not fully settled, not entirely done arriving, but here. Edmund Carver would have liked it, she said. Tell me more about him sometime, Colton said. I will, she said, and she meant it. He knew by now how she meant things, the specific texture of when she was saying something because it was what you said, and when she was saying something because it was what she intended. This was the second kind. The children came out in their usual sequence. Owen first, fully dressed and already talking. Emma right behind him in her nightgown because she'd managed to get out the door before anyone could stop her. Lily next, quietly. Wyatt last, with his boots properly laced, which he'd recently started doing without being reminded. They all looked at the sign. Owen read it aloud because that was what Owen did. Emma said it was good. Lily reached out and touched one of the carved letters briefly, The way she touched Vivian's hand at the kitchen table on the night of the first court hearing. A single moment of contact and then release. Wyatt stood in front of the sign with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted back slightly to read it properly. And he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "Dad carved it wrong in the first 2 tries. I heard him in the barn." "Wyatt," Colton said. "It's better now, though," Wyatt said, with the tone of someone giving a considered assessment. "The letters are even." "Thank you," Colton said, with the tone of someone accepting criticism from a 7-year-old with more grace than he might have managed 6 months ago. Vivian was looking at Wyatt with an expression that was not quite a smile and was not quite something else. And Wyatt glanced at her and then looked away, and then looked back with that quality he'd had since the barn in May. The deliberate concession, the thing he did when he'd decided something and was acting on it even though it cost him a little. "It's a good sign," he told her directly, like the opinion mattered and she was who he was giving it to. "Your father made it," she said. "I know," Wyatt said, "but it was your words." There is something that gets learned slowly, usually too slowly, about the way people arrive in your life. They come in with what they're carrying, and what they're carrying is almost never visible from the outside, and almost never what you'd guess from looking. The woman who steps off a train in a mended coat with a weathered suitcase is not what she appears to be. The man who puts out an advertisement asking for help in plain language is not just asking for help. The children who are angry and watchful and quiet by turns are not difficult. They are simply people who have been through something, which is the most ordinary thing in the world, and also the hardest. What Vivian Ashcroft carried in that suitcase was evidence against a railroad company. That was the practical thing, and it was real, and it mattered, and it saved the Hayes land and helped save others beside it. The federal audit ran through 2 full years and resulted in 11 land claims being revisited, and 4 of them ultimately returned to the families who had held them. Aldrich cited the Hayes case in his formal report to the Federal Land Office. The territorial newspaper ran a final piece when the audit concluded, and it mentioned Vivian by name and described her as someone who had preserved the truth in the only way available to her, quietly, persistently, and at personal cost, until she found a place where it could be used. That was accurate as far as it went. What it didn't say, because newspapers don't have room for this kind of thing, was that what she'd really been carrying was the harder part. The hope, in spite of everything, that the truth was still worth something, and that somewhere there was a situation where it could matter. The willingness to sit in a boarding house in Laramie for 18 months and not give up. The decision, when the advertisement appeared, to take a chance on a man she didn't know, and a family she'd never met, and a piece of land she'd only read about in handwritten field notes, because she needed somewhere to go, and they needed someone who could help. And sometimes that's enough of a reason. She wasn't perfect. She had a habit of working past the point where other people would have stopped, which was useful and also occasionally made her difficult to live with. She was not naturally demonstrative, which the children had learned to work around in their various ways, Emma by simply not asking permission for affection, Owen by translating the demonstrations she did make, Lily by understanding that presence was its own language, Wyatt by eventually deciding that consistency was worth more than warmth, and that Vivian had plenty of it. She held things inside longer than was probably healthy, and Colton had learned over time to ask directly when he thought something was being held, and she had learned over time to answer without making him ask twice. They were not a perfect family. They were a real one, which is different and better and harder and enough. Years later, Wyatt Hayes became a land surveyor. He was one of the best in the territory, precise, methodical, and deeply committed to the kind of accuracy that protected ordinary people from the particular fraud that had nearly taken his family's land. He learned from his stepmother and from his own years of study, and he taught his own children in turn, and the knowledge passed on through the family the way useful things pass on, through practice and attention and care. Owen went east to study law and came back to practice it, specifically in land rights cases, specifically with the argument that property documentation needed to be verified against original surveys rather than company-filed maps. He cited the Hayes case in his first major brief and won it. Lily became the person people came to when they didn't know where else to go. She had a gift for reading situations that had been there since she was 2.5 years old, watching over her siblings while their mother was sick, and she used it the way people use gifts that were given in difficulty, carefully and with full understanding of what they cost. Emma grew up to be a botanist, which surprised everyone and, upon reflection, surprised no one. She had been conducting unauthorized experiments in the Hayes kitchen garden since she was 5, and the sign on the gate had been her favorite thing about the ranch property since the March morning Colton hung it. She could read a survey map because all the Hayes children could read a survey map, but it was not her primary language. Her primary language was growing things, which she pursued with the same confident determination she'd applied to everything since she was 3 years old, and told a stranger on a train platform that her coat had a hole in it, and they had thread and they could fix it. Vivian lived at the Hayes Ranch for the rest of her life. That is a simple sentence. It is also enormous. She had lived in enough places without staying, without the sense that her being there was permanent, that her presence was woven into the place rather than temporary in it, that the permanence of the ranch was something she didn't take for granted and never fully stopped noticing. In the mornings, early, before anyone else was up, she sometimes stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the land and felt the specific weight of something that was hers. Not just Colton's, not just the children's. Hers too. Earned in the only way things are really earned, not by purchase or inheritance, but by showing up and doing the work and staying. The leather folder stayed on the hallway shelf beside the almanac and the family record book for years, and then Wyatt asked if he could have the field notes for his professional archive, and she gave them to him because their work was done and they belonged with the person who would carry the knowledge forward. The suitcase she kept. It sat in the corner of the bedroom, and she occasionally used it for practical things, and occasionally didn't use it at all, and it was like most objects that have carried something important, both completely ordinary and not. On the anniversary of the court ruling, not a date they made a formal thing of, but one they noticed, Colton and Vivian had a habit of walking the east boundary. Not quickly, not purposefully, just walking it the way you walk something you want to keep knowing. The ground under their feet, and the markers in the earth, and the sky overhead, and the particular quality of the air on a Wyoming evening in late spring, which smelled of grass and distance and something that was almost like permanence. One evening on that walk, years in, Wyatt's oldest child running ahead of them in the grass, Emma's dog barking at something in the distance, Colton said, "We did all right." Vivian walked beside him for a moment. "We did," she said. "Better than all right," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Don't get sentimental." "Too late," he said. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had taken a while to come easily, that had been there from early on but quietly, carefully, not yet ready to be unreserved. Now it was unreserved, and it sounded like someone who had set something down a long time ago and no longer remembered exactly what it had weighed. The ranch gate was ahead of them, and the sign was on it, and the letters were even, and the boundary was where it had always been, where the original survey had put it, where the stone markers in the earth had been waiting all along to prove. Every promise honored. It is the simplest possible thing, and the hardest. And the only thing, in the end, that builds something worth keeping. Not the grand gestures, not the dramatic moments in courtrooms, not the stories that travel to 4 newspapers. The ordinary daily decision to do what you said you would do, to stay where you said you would stay, to be who you told someone you were going to be. That was what Colton had done on the platform at Redstone Station when he kept his promise to a woman who apologized for herself before she'd given him any reason to be disappointed. That was what Vivian had done for 3 years in a boarding house in Laramie, keeping faith with field notes that most people would have given up on. That was what they built together, imperfectly and with difficulty and with 4 children and a dog and a kitchen table that had seen more significant conversations than most courtrooms, on a piece of Wyoming land that had been worth fighting for all along. The evening light went gold across the plain. The sign held on the gate, and the Hayes family walked home in the last of the sun, which is not an ending so much as a return. The kind that happens again and again in a life that is working the way a life is supposed to work. Not because everything went right, but because the people in it kept their word to each other when it was hard, and didn't stop when it would have been easier to. That is the whole story. It is also the only story, told different ways by different people, in different places, on different pieces of ground. The promise, the keeping of it, the life that becomes possible because someone chose to.
I love the Smecks. That has always been a mask for me. So it's like a game, recognized game. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I get you. I get you. I always thought growing up I was an extrovert. It turns out I'm not because I need time when I need to step away. See, like some people say extrovert, introvert for introverts is the same for. Yeah, yeah. I get that. No, the thing is, like, I am certainly, I get energy from other people. Like, I'll sometimes need to call my mom so that I can gain some energy. And that's all it is, you know? Or I need to